The hospital kept me in that night for observation, so I called my neighbor and had him bring me a 6-pack and some cocaine to the hospital room, and we had our own little party there. My name's Chris, and this is my testimony. I was raised outside of Toronto. I didn't know much of my biological father, so I was raised mostly by my Christian mom. From the age of 6 until I was 13, I was raised as well by my stepfather and 3 older stepbrothers, 2 of which are now pastors. I was brought up in a strong Christian home. When I was 13, I witnessed my stepfather physically abuse my mom. After my mom returned from a planned vacation shortly after this, my mom left with me and my sister. Until recently, I never spoke with my heroes and greatest influences, my brothers, again. Within a few months, my mom's new boyfriend moved in with us. That lasted about a year, and again, we moved on, changing homes, schools, churches, and friends again. We settled down for a few years, and I had my first long-term relationship, some solid friends, and found a church to call home. At 16, my mom's newest love interest came to our home from BC and spent a week with us. That summer, I volunteered to work at a Christian camp. While I was there, my mom visited with her new boyfriend in BC, and upon returning, met me at the camp to tell me that a week after returning home, I'd be moving to British Columbia with my future stepdad and 2 stepbrothers that I had never met. I wasn't given much of an opportunity to say goodbye to my friends, my church, my girlfriend, nor my direct family that I had grown up with my entire life. At 16, I was literally thrown across the country and again started a new life. I really struggled with this. A few months later, after the house sold, my mom and sister would finally move west to our new home. We found a new church and I tried to fit in there, but didn't really feel accepted as I had with other churches. So I turned my back on my beliefs, started smoking and drinking regularly, and changed the group of friends I associated with to reflect these choices. I finally felt the level of acceptance in my new home. My grandma had intended to come for a visit that summer. 2 weeks before her arrival, we got news that she had suddenly passed away. We returned for her funeral in Ontario, where I got to see my family again. I spent the time with my grandpa and had a few beers with them and connected even more. This man was the only man I had in my entire life, and I was his only grandson. We were always buddies, and I looked up to him and respected him. Life went on. I ended up in a new long-term relationship and ended up with her in Calgary for a year and a half. My roommates there dabbled in the drug scene, and when offered, I would stay away from the heavy stuff, but would never turn down a good drink and a puff. After breaking up with my girlfriend of almost 4 years, I drank a lot more, and this led me to a few legal run-ins. I was given the choice of jail time or returning to Cranbrook and serving my time on house arrest at my mom and stepdad's home. I chose the latter and returned home to a strict 9-month house arrest order, but found ways around it and still managed to stay out past curfew and have a few drinks with the boys almost every night after work. I came home late one night to seeing my stepdad on his computer and acting really weird. The following day, my mom snooped his computer and found a file he had written on the hatred he had for me and my mom. How he had destroyed his happy life, pages and pages written over the past few years. They split up shortly after this came to light. It was back to me and my mom as my sister was away at university. I drank a lot more heavily after taking this knowledge on my shoulders. I found cocaine shortly after this and was immediately hooked. I could drink more, party harder, and I fit in better, or so I thought. After burning numerous bridges, I ended up moving to Nelson, starting over again, and carried my addictions and negative beliefs with me. I met new people that shared my addictions, exploited those habits, and eventually met my future wife through mutual friends. We didn't have a long dating period as she became pregnant within a couple of months of dating. My daughter was born to us 9 months later, and I finally and truly experienced some sort of joy in life. But I still continued to drink and party almost daily. I continued using drugs and eventually turned to heavy opiates and other downers to bring me down enough to sleep from the daily cocaine and alcohol binges. I ended up in the hospital a lot. My choices brought on some serious medical issues, including spontaneous lung collapses, pancreatitis, appendicitis, kidney stones, and serious blood clotting issues. I ended up one night at the hospital puking, coughing up blood, and was given vitamin K to counteract the blood thinners I was on for the clots. I had a severe anaphylactic reaction and flatlined in the hospital. I was given epinephrine and adrenaline and revived after being clinically dead for over a minute. The hospital kept me in that night for observation, so I called my neighbor and had him bring me a six-pack and some cocaine to the hospital room, and we had our own little party there. This was normal, right? I didn't have a problem. Everyone has funds. Insanity, it's real. We had our oldest son 2 years later, and my addictions were rampant and evident, but I wore a mask well at home and around family. When I learned the news of our third child, I ran. I ran to the mountains. I didn't show up for work. I didn't tell anybody where I was. Didn't answer phone or text. I didn't care. I didn't know how I was going to keep living. I drank and partied to oblivion for almost a week. I returned home to the chaos of everyday life, and my youngest was born. Shortly after, we were married, and I continued to wear my mask while living in my own personal hell. Although I was not a good person, an angry person, hurt and broken person, I was always loyal to my wife. This wasn't reciprocated, and I found out she cheated on me numerous times, yet forgave and tried to move on. Near the end of our relationship, we were at a wedding, and long story short, I was beat unrecognizable with golf clubs by two individuals and ended up in the hospital again. After a few days of healing, my wife was given the ultimatum by her mother that I left, or her sister's family would no longer be a part of their family. So I was forced from my home to not knowing where I'd sleep that night. I was pretty much homeless at this point. My mom and a good friend came to visit and tried to keep me in a positive frame of mind that weekend while we found somewhere for me to live. We went out for dinner one night, and as we left, I noticed two unmarked police cars. As I got in my truck and rounded the corner, I was met by numerous marked cars, which stopped me, drew their guns on me, and arrested me for allegedly threatening my 5-year-old daughter on the phone while I was at work. I was thrown in jail for the remainder of the weekend. My mom hired a lawyer while I was locked up, and Tuesday morning when I faced a judge, she put her home up for bond to keep me out of jail. My long journey with the court systems had just begun. With zero evidence and completely false allegations, I was eventually told I could not have direct or indirect contact with my kids for a total of 18 months. No phone calls, no visits. I couldn't even text and tell them that I existed. During this period, a good friend reached out to me as he knew I was struggling and invited me to Cranbrook for Thanksgiving weekend with him and his family. I returned to Cranbrook for the weekend and reconnected with a former girlfriend from high school. One of our first conversations was, if we're going to be together, I couldn't be doing drugs around her or her daughter. So I stopped using and filled that void with more alcohol than I'd ever drank before. After about 6 months of living together, concerns were raised to MCFD about my drinking, and I was forced to leave their home. I continued to spiral downhill after this. I sobered up enough for MCFD to allow me to return home, but quickly ended up back drinking. I was eventually granted phone calls to my kids and started connecting them on the phone again, yet I continued to drink. After some more poor choices, my girlfriend told me to leave, and I ended up struggling to feed my alcoholic tendencies, paying rent at the cheapest flea bag hotel I could find, and not being able to be a parent nor a partner. This was my bottom. I had dug the hole so deep that I had nothing left to live for. God had always been beside me through my battles. I'd pull him off the shelf during hard times. I'd scream out to him in anger and desperation, "Fix me, fix this, where are you? Why must I go on?" I remember praying one night in that hotel room, another desperation prayer. I couldn't do this anymore. The next day I ended up at the hospital, not for anything physical this time, not for another trip to the psych ward, but for my first meeting. As I walked through the hallways, I was met with a choice: turn left to the meeting or continue straight to the morgue. Fitting. As I listened that night, the first steps of recovery were summed up to me in 6 words. I can't, he can, let him. My selfishness, my self-pity, my resentments, my anger, my way of thinking, it wasn't working. I couldn't be a father to my kids. I couldn't be a partner to my best friend. I couldn't look at the person in the mirror anymore. I couldn't keep doing things my way. It was time for me to surrender and turn it over. One choice to turn my will over to my Savior changed everything. I can say now, over 8 years later, my obsession with alcohol and drugs ended that night. Like a light switch, He took that from me when I turned things over. As I continued following this path, life got easier. Through prayer and faith, my anger dissipated, my selfishness turned to selflessness. He showed me grace as I humbled myself and my ego. 6 months later, I headed to court to gain access and visitation to my kids again. I had a lot of fear and anxiety that day, and I remember praying no matter what the outcome, I would accept it, as it was the path He had laid before me. I was granted visitation and much more that day. Visits with my kids were monthly and phone calls often. Every day I woke up and prayed, giving up my will to the path He had put me on. In my struggles, I would pause my day and turn things over to Him again. A few years later, after making the choice to follow Jesus daily, I received a phone call no parent ever wants to receive. My kids had been abused by a person in trust. My anger and rage bubbled up immediately. This was the first time I heard my Creator's voice clearly. I was told to call my sponsor, another strong believer. We prayed together, and he explained to me, much like my addictions, this man was sick in his own way. Through this, I learned to pray for others, pray for their weakness, pray for their salvation, to continue to pray for resentments and anger, and to have faith that he would take these from me and my family. These events still have long-term emotions attached to them, but knowing that these can and are taken through his grace is enough to get me through the hard times. The man pled guilty to the charges and spent federal time. Prior to his release, I received a phone call from my kids and their mother. They were in a state of fear that he was being released back into their community. As a father, I made the tough decision to return to the West Kootenays to be closer to my kids in their time of need. Moving back meant starting over and leaving the life I was comfortable with. However, again, his voice was clear in telling me this is where I needed to be. Shortly after setting my feet down in Castlegar, I was extended an invitation to New Life Church. I remember walking through the doors, sitting in a back corner in a congregation singing happy birthday to those celebrating that week. I immediately felt like this was a family that I wanted to be a part of. We attended every Sunday, and I felt that my family had been accepted here. It was a Sunday morning when I got some medical tests back and was told my body was riddled with Hodgkin's lymphoma. Being new to the community, I didn't have too many people to turn to, so I went where I knew I belonged, church. With all that fear and anxiety, I walked through the doors of New Life to be prayed over that morning. I can clearly remember the calmness that quickly consumed me. The understanding that everything would be okay filled me. As I went through 12 rounds of intense chemotherapy, my faith grew exponentially. Each round, though physically exhausted me, taught me to have faith in His healing powers. I continued to work 10 to 12 hours a day. I didn't have any side effects. I gained weight, and I spent more time with my kids through this battle. At my final pre-chemo checkup, my doctor didn't know how he would set the IV. I was hurting. My veins had been burned, and some had collapsed from the barrage of chemicals being pushed through them. The saline hurt that morning when we tried checking my veins. I remember driving to the hospital the following morning feeling a lot of fear of the pain I was going to endure that day, but knowing without a shadow of a doubt that He would get me through this somehow. I kept repeating to myself, turn it over, He's got me. As the nurse was trying to set my IV, she couldn't find a vein. I was jabbed quite a few times with no luck. As I'm physically suffering through this, I kept reminding myself, turn it over, He's got me. My nurse heard me and took it literally. She turned my arm over, and I remember her saying, in 27 years of doing this, I've never seen that vein. We're going to use that one. Without any further issues, He brought me through that day, and my battle with cancer was won through His mercy. I was blessed shortly after this. Sitting in my apartment again, He spoke to me. It was really weird as I was told to go outside and mow my lawn. His voice was so prophetic this time that I was literally scared to start my lawnmower because I knew this would change my life. I cautiously mowed my lawn, then sat down to pray and meditate. He told me it was time to buy a home. With a 602 credit score, zero money in savings, and an $18 an hour job, He blessed me with a home for my family. As I continued to follow the path He was laying in front of me, I was given the choice to be baptized and knew immediately that was the life I wanted. that I wanted more than anything to continue following Jesus and the path he has for me. My kids also chose to be baptized alongside me that day. After a long and strenuous battle, a lot of faith in his redeeming glory, and a continuous choice to follow Jesus, I was blessed to have a 50-50 parenting time agreement put in place with my kids. I have an amazing relationship with each of my kids, my stepdaughter and my fiance. I've recently made a career change which allowed me to be working alongside other believers, giving me more time to give back to my family, my church, my neighbors, and my community. God is good. God is my Redeemer. God is your Redeemer. I can't, he can, and I will continue to let him lead me.